Teachers have to plan for a year ahead. And this presentation is about how teachers plan with some things that are decided for them and some that they can choose with their faculty colleagues. We're planning for a year of patriotism and pluralism because we're talking about holidays. Now, for today's discussion, this is a public school context because public schools have got mandated holidays. The schools are also going to work around some administrative issues too, like grading and things like this. But the purpose of us talking about holidays is that schools are a community center. So even if you are not planning to become a teacher in a public school, you still have a vested interest in what happens there because of the community experience and how schools are going to involve you. But the third component of the discussion is a rather honorable heritage of protest that is part of being American. So who is in the classroom? Little kids. And those kids grow and develop. They're organized by developmental level, but also they change in their development in the time that they are with you. And you are represented by the apple here. And a teacher's job is to prepare a child for the world, but also to bring the world to the child. And so throughout this presentation, I'm going to add what I think I'd like children to be thinking. And so you can see that this is in green at the bottom of the screen. I would like my students to think, I'm part of a world that my family has made better. And so the first thing I'm demonstrating here is that whatever happens in your class, you are trying to think of what the student's point of view is. And this is what I'd like a child to be thinking. But that brings up something about my role as a teacher. In legal terms, I'm in loco parentis. I'm in the place of parents. And that means that if I bring a flag into the classroom, I have to respect the fact that there are different attitudes about it. And so I want to share with you my Hippocratic oath of teaching. Never, 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 never put a child in a position where he has to choose between his home and school. That is so hurtful. It also is contrary to the whole concept of bringing the flag in the classroom because e pluribus unum is our national motto, which means out of many, we are one. In classroom terms, that means everybody counts or nobody counts. So this is revealed in your classroom management approach as opposed to a classroom culture approach. Classroom management is designed to control distractions from learning. It's usually focused on managing behaviors that make it difficult for you to teach. But a classroom culture is creating a common identity with shared behaviors and shared values. And that's what you want to create with your students, not just managing their behavior, but to develop an identity. They're familiar with this. E pluribus unum is familiar to most kids because they've handled money. That's what's written on the banner that the eagle is holding in its beak, and that's found on every dollar bill. It's also found on every coin. And so unity is our currency. If it does not unify, it is inappropriate. If you see anything that looks like people are trying to divide the community, pit people against each other, then that is not being democratic. So what do I want a kid to think? What will it take for us to be friends? Our goal is to get together and to be unified and to be a community. So civic education is in the classroom in 3 different dimensions. We want students to participate. We want students to see themselves as citizens and have an American identity. But we also want them to be skillful. And when we bring the flag in the classroom, ideally, that's what's going to happen. Those will be combined. And you can probably recognize this from the different questions. Who is involved? We want to include everybody. What are we learning? We want the lessons to be very focused. How are they learning it? The way they learn is also going to be civic participation, and they should know why. So all of these dimensions make it meaningful for students. And so that's called an integrated curriculum. I want kids to be thinking, I'm getting smarter. So in the state of Washington, there are goals of the Washington Basic Education Act. And it's interesting to note that the second one, know and apply the core concepts and principles of mathematics, social, physical, and life sciences, civics and history, including different cultures and participation in representative government, geography, arts, health, and fitness. This one takes up the most real estate. And this is what the holidays are all about. Well, how many holidays are there? I thought this was kind of clever, but kind of distracting. All of the holidays tend to happen at the same time of the month. And so they combined it into one sort of generic month here. I don't know if that's very helpful. It's a little bit distracting. But what I do know is that not all of the holidays happen during school. For instance, July 4th, Independence Day, that's got to be one of the most important holidays. And it doesn't happen during school. But I want kids to understand it. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That is the Declaration of Independence. That is where we have the rule of law and a written constitution. We don't do anything unless it's written down and everybody agreed that that is the law. And that's what justice, equity, and community are all about. But what it demonstrates more importantly is that there is a proper procedure for protest, and you have a right to protest. You have a right to disagree. And in your classroom, it's really dangerous if the students are so obedient and so compliant, they're not going to speak up if something is wrong. So you have to make sure there's an opportunity for them to know how it's appropriate for them to protest. Well, let's take a look at our school year. You know that this is a school year because it starts in September. And to be helpful, each of the dates that is a mandated holiday, I've got in red. But how about if I add a flag? And that makes it a little bit easier to see them. Not all of them are patriotic. We have a long tradition. Christmas is a national holiday, even though Christianity is not the national religion, but it's become a custom. The same is true with New Year's, which isn't a Christian holiday. It's a very ancient pagan holiday, but it has become a national holiday. There are some other reasons that we have holidays, but to be honest, for a school calendar, we don't even call them holidays. They're days off and predictable distractions. In fact, it's kind of a joke in the teacher's lounge when you say, oh my gosh, we've actually got 5 days of school this week. We don't have any reason to have it off. We also have some cultural holidays that are not mandated. For instance, there's Halloween, and you can see that there's Valentine's Day and St. Patrick's Day. These are actually commercial holidays that have been promoted by mostly candy companies. But they've also become multicultural. We've become very familiar with Dia de los Muertos. And just like all holidays, students don't always have the same understanding of the meaning of it, but they certainly like to have an opportunity to celebrate. We also have some seasons. For instance, Hispanic Heritage is going to start in the middle of September and go through October. And there are also some events that are not national holidays, but they're widely recognized. For instance, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. I can tell you that February, people have now become accustomed to the fact that in January you have Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and February is going to be Black History Month. In my own family, Very soon we're going to have 17. Mai, which is the 17th of May in Norwegian, because it was Norwegian Independence Day. Well, all of your students may have some connection to some seasons throughout the school year that is quite meaningful for themselves, and it would be a good idea for you to try to predict what these are. So you can predict your cultural assets. It's called an asset because it is a benefit if your students have some identity that is associated with a community, some shared language, some shared background, some shared history that is both for pride but mostly for identity. And so you, as a teacher or a school board member or just a community member, have cultural competence if you're aware of the fact that people come from different backgrounds. Race and ethnicity is kind of an easy way to identify things, but that's not necessarily culture that the students would recognize, and there's a lot of overlaps. Perhaps you're familiar with these stats. You'll see that Washington State is a little bit different than the rest of the country. It's a little wider, you can see here. However, it's also more diverse. But Black African American is very, very low compared to the rest of the country. We've only got 3%. So no wonder there were a lot of people in Washington who didn't get Black Lives Matter. As far as Asian, ours is much larger than the rest of the country, but it's still a very low percentage. And the same is true with Native American and Pacific Islanders. We tend to have greater diversity. We also have a higher education level, and that's sort of ironic when we're thinking about our poverty distribution, which is also pretty great. So I don't know if this is helpful, but this information is widely available, and you should be able to find this information out about any school that you're interested in. So back to our calendar, where we have some seasons that are not really holidays, specific to religion, like Easter might be, and Passover started last week. But we also have a season that is assessments. So if you grew up in public schools, you probably remember some standardized assessment periods where the whole week was devoted to these special tests. Teachers spend all year getting ready for those. And it's really going to influence what you're able to do that week and all the weeks leading up to it. Well, let's talk about the holidays, though, as they sometimes are called. It used to be called Christmas break. Now it's a winter break. How does that affect your classroom? Well, not everybody is looking forward to the holiday. Sometimes kids, their folks are working, and especially the upper middle school and secondary kids, they end up being the parents for the younger kids once the holidays come. Or sometimes they're going to have to go on a trip. Now, I start to think of this whole foggy time that starts just about Thanksgiving, because a lot of stuff will start cascading then. All the kids who are in band and in different performances will have to have extra rehearsals, so they're going to be absent from your class, and you're going to be participating in them as well. But something else is going to happen in that the kids who have blended families, their dad lives in Connecticut and they need to fly out there for Christmas. The family is not going to wait until you get out of school on the 22nd of December, because the airplane prices are going to go up in the middle of December. And so they're going to get a plane ticket they can afford. And it means that the kid may miss some school and have to go early in order to be with his family at the holidays. Behavior starts to deteriorate after Thanksgiving as there's a lot more disruptions and stress going on. And especially if it's a very impoverished family, they're not looking forward to a fun holiday vacation. At the end of the year, you have an interesting foggy time also. I've shared with you that I come from a military family, and there's an interesting phenomenon that happens about halfway through the last quarter. It is legally possible for a kid to leave school and not have to go back to school someplace else. Now, why would that affect a military family? Well, the person who is in the military may get orders to go to a different place any time of the year. But the family will say, oh, I hate to disrupt their school. So one spouse and the kids will stay to finish out the school year while the other spouse goes to the next duty station. And they're just waiting, when can we get our family back together again? And as soon as they can legally leave, they're out the door. And so the last month of school, they're dropping like flies. Kids just disappear because their families have moved. Another thing that happens is when the lease is up on apartments and they have to move, and they may be moving out of district. And so the kid doesn't have any choice about this. Sometimes the families are going to be very mobile. And then we have summer. Sometimes kids are going to be in summer school, but from a teacher's point of view, that's when you're getting ready for the next year. Before the first day of school, I already have 180 days in mind. I've already have my plot points of when I want to get projects done. I already know when all the holidays are going to be. I know when the grading periods are going to end, and I start to structure my curriculum based on the constraints of my year. Now, when does school start? Increasingly, it is in August. However, locally, in Ellensburg, it doesn't start until after Labor Day because that's when the rodeo is. And there are some states where it's illegal for schools to start before Labor Day, and it's because they depend upon the high school students to be working the tourism industry. So school starts, but are all the kids there yet? Nah, I don't think so. It sometimes takes a week or so for all the kids to show up. So that, my friends, is how I see the year. And I think that it might be interesting for you to know that there are some state holidays or observances that are also mandated. And one of them that you may not realize that you have been celebrating is Temperance and Good Citizenship Day. Now, this is very close in January to Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is a mandated holiday and is a little bit more obvious. This started in 1923, which interestingly enough was the same year that the rodeo started in Ellensburg, and it was based on prohibition. Prohibition was a legal effort to restrict drinking. Alcohol was illegal. And so temperance means to not overdo. Temperance means to just do things in moderation. So they wanted to make sure that every teacher, every classroom had at least one lesson to say, you're not supposed to overdo this stuff. Now they probably have something about not using drugs. But at the same time, there was a lot of immigration, and there was a concern that immigrants wouldn't know how to be good Americans. So they wanted to make sure that that was included in some lessons too. So that's why it's Temperance and Good Citizenship Day. Now, 1923 is a century ago, and so some things changed. And you've heard, I'm sure, of the civil rights era of the 60s. And what they did was change some language to say not prohibition, because we're not just talking about alcohol. We're talking about self-restraint with anything that could be harmful to yourself or other people. And just be nice to each other. Don't be a jerk. And so you can tell where a lot of this language came from. It's a language of tolerance, and don't be mean to other people, and don't abuse people or leave them out. More recently, in 2009, they added civic education because this was part of the Basic Education Act there. And in 2013, they added this part. If you are old enough to vote, if you're 18 years old, you get the day off from school to go register to vote. Now, this doesn't happen very often. We have very few third graders who are turning 18 years old. But in high schools, if anybody is turning 18, they get the day off to go register to vote. Now, I mentioned that this was very close to the third Monday in January, which is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And you are all young enough that you have experienced this. However, you may not realize that not all states have celebrated this in the same way, this focus on civil disobedience that he's known for, of radical tolerance. So in 1968, he was assassinated. And I will tell you, I remember the day I was in high school. It wasn't a holiday until 1983. But it was not a holiday that was instantly accepted by all states. In fact, Arizona refused to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day until the NFL threatened not to have any bowl games in Arizona unless they would honor it. There was another state which said, no, we'd like to have a holiday, but we're not going to call it Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We're going to call it Robert E. Lee Day. And it wasn't the only state to want to do that. So if you remember anything from Civil War history, you would know that Robert E. Lee was in the opposition and was pro-slavery. It may help you to look at what the previous versions of each of these state flags were to know why they may be feeling this way, that they do not want to recognize Martin Luther King Jr. Day. A little closer to home, our neighbor, Idaho, said, okay, we'll have a holiday, but we're not going to call it Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We're going to call it Human Rights Day. This is a little bit like saying instead of Black Lives Matter, you say all lives matter because you don't want to admit that some people have not been treated very well. And even further, we have in New England, they called it Civil Rights Day. And in Utah, they wanted to also recognize Browning, who was the the manufacturer of guns. So you have quite a varied response to this, that it was a federal decision that it's a holiday, but states have got rights to define their own holidays as well, whether they're going to respect them. As far as Black History Month, this has kind of an interesting background. Many students are going to learn a little bit in American history about the triangle here. Very few students actually learn much about Africa itself, the fact that it's got over 50 countries and is 4 times the size of ours as a continent. And there's a smattering of influence here. So maybe you remember Uncle Tom's Cabin. I don't know if you actually read the whole book. This is a copy of the first edition. Very powerful book because it convinced Northern abolitionists of why it was immoral to have slavery. It was the first book in which a Black character was seen as a full human person, not just a beast of burden or some villain. And Tom, who was called Uncle Tom by Liza, was brave, and he was hardworking, and he was principled, and he was ethical, and he was all things virtuous. That has since become something of a pejorative. To call somebody Uncle Tom means that they're denying their Black heritage and trying to please white expectations. Maybe you've seen this. This is Pullman porters. At the time that they had train travel, a Pullman was a car that was like a floating hotel and restaurant. And Pullman had the bright idea of hiring only Black porters or workers so that you could tell the difference of who was a worker and who was going to be a passenger. And it was a profoundly important job because it was well paid. You got your uniforms, you got a place to sleep and eat, and you got to travel. And so it became a very important job that would explain the African American diaspora from the Deep South, where there was incredible impoverishment and poor education and abuses, that they could spread. And that's why, to this day, cities that have large concentrations of African Americans tend to be railroad hubs. So it'd be Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Minneapolis. Perhaps you recognize some of these other people who've had a profound influence on our culture, both entertainment and athletics. And if you're expecting to be a teacher, you should know these people instantly because they're heroes. Now, this guy, I don't know his name, but he represents a very important person when we had segregation or apartheid in this country, where they could separate people based on their color and deny them jobs, and it was not fair. It was before the Equal Rights Act. 100 years after the Civil War was won, they still did not have civil rights, and now the fight continues. Here's a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen, very well educated, accomplished pilots, and it took Eleanor Roosevelt coming down and making a photo op to force them to allow them to be able to join the military and do something more than being a cook or a guard or a driver or a cleaner. That was all that they would allow Black soldiers to do. And this was the first group that then became commissioned as officers, and they were rock stars. They were incredibly effective, very inspirational. And they confronted some assumptions on the parts of a lot of white racists who sincerely believed that people of color did not have the capacity to be successful and to think. They honestly thought that they were subhuman. And I'm embarrassed to say there are still people who think that now. Here we have Buffalo Soldiers who wisely realized that if they would leave the areas that had so much abuses and exploitation, they might have a better life. And so they headed west. So we have Benjamin Banneker, who designed Washington, D.C. We have Frederick Douglass. We have C.J. Walker. We've got the first billionaires. Perhaps you know about Brown v. Topeka, which ended the segregation in schools. There are a lot of familiar people here. And this is American history. It's not Black history. It's American history. Because what we all have in common is that we want our own capacity to live our lives. So we have an honorable heritage of protest where people say, wait a minute, this is not fair. So here we have a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. walking to the Birmingham jail. He's a very powerful influence. But who influenced him? Well, he mentioned Gandhi. And Gandhi, who was in India and experiencing great unfairness, who was he influenced by? Well, from his Hindu religion, he was influenced with the idea of being at one with the universe, but he was also influenced by Americans. In high school, maybe you read on the duty of civil disobedience by the Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Walden. Gandhi was influenced by this, but at the same time was the first English translation of Hindu writings, the Bhagavad Gita, and that influenced the Transcendentalists in America. Meanwhile, if we go back even further, 400 years, we have Martin Luther. Martin Luther King named himself after Martin Luther because he heard the story of his brave protest and having the courage of his convictions. Martin Luther King Jr. then named after him. And how could that make a connection? Well, he was pretty much a rabble rouser, and he objected to the way the church was controlling the state. He thought there needs to be a separation of church and state. If you want to know about religion, you go to church. If you want to do politics, you should do the state stuff, but it should not be there. But he also felt strongly about literacy, and that's where it ties into becoming a teacher. At that time, it was illegal to have the Bible in any language except Latin and the original Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. He translated it into his own language of German. He did this when he was under house arrest and spent a year in prison. Most people can't read it in a year, and he translated it into German, and it became a bestseller because the printing press had just become invented in the prior century. And that influenced in England a king James, said, well, I wouldn't mind the Bible in my language, thank you very much. So let's translate it for us too. And we have the King James Version of the Bible, which the Pilgrims brought along with some other translations to the United States. Before it was the United States, it was the colonies. And that was the only book that was used for education. But it influenced Americans to say everybody should be able to read. America was the first country where we assumed literacy. Everybody is supposed to be able to read. So, my friends, we have a worldwide effort of making sure that information is transparent and people can make their own decisions. And we also have a worldwide example that things can change if people have got a good reason for it and they speak up about it. And that's what Black History Month is supposed to be, not just about African American history, but about the concept that history is continuously changing. King County was named for a plantation owner in Alabama. But then, after Martin Luther King Jr. visited and then was assassinated, and then it became a holiday, they renamed the county the same name, but to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr. instead of a slave owner. And this was authorized in 2005. We now have a whole new holiday that was just proclaimed recently, Juneteenth. And interestingly enough, it goes along with literacy because it is celebrating a day when people were finally told the information that the Civil War was over, and the slave owners had withheld that information and not let them know. And that's why currently we have some very loud protests for not having access to information and not having due process. So this has become a new holiday, which doesn't always occur during school. Most time school is already going to be out, but it's going to be right at the end of school. So our honorable heritage of protest starts with a Declaration of Independence by the colonials. You have a right to protest if it's done without harming other people and if you can explain the reason. King said, riot is the language of the unheard. If you don't have an opportunity to say why you think something is not fair, then you will find a way for people to hear you. Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. So if people in power are not listening, they have to be careful because they can reach a tipping point where people say, if you're not listening, we will force you to listen. Well, let's talk about another interesting expression, and that would be the national anthem. So the War of 1812 was kind of a recurrent repeat of the Revolutionary War here. But the national anthem was based on the Star-Spangled Banner. 1931, it was made the national anthem. And this is following World War I and the other efforts of immigration. But again, 1932, NFL starts, and they are using this song to start sporting events. It was being used to start sporting events before it was even recognized as the national anthem. You probably recognize this as a fairly famous opportunity for protest, which has brought with great controversy. But if people have got a right to protest, as long as it's done without harm and for a good reason, and they explain it, it should be tolerated. Perhaps you read this book by Avi, Nothing But the Truth, and it's the story of a middle school where they're supposed to sing the national anthem and he refused, and he had some very good reasons for it. The Pledge of Allegiance, it used to be standard everywhere. This started in 1892 for the 400th anniversary of Columbus's visit. And this is the original pledge I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And the idea was to have a flag in every classroom, and it was promoted by manufacturers of flags. Well, what changed over the years is that in 1923, this is that same year that we had Temperance and Good Citizenship Day start, they added to the flag of the United States of America. Originally, the pledge was supposed to be that you should have some nationalistic affiliation with some country somewhere. But now they said, no, we're going to use this just for our country here. And in 1954, with the Cold War and Red Scares, they added under God. Under God had not been part of the pledge before that. When the pledge was originally started, children were supposed to raise their hand toward the flag, and when you said, I pledge allegiance to the flag, they would turn their hand like this. Well, unfortunately, it ends up looking like a Nazi salute. And so instead, now we put a hand on heart, you take your hat off, you stand there. So this underscores the idea that things change. They change for a lot of different reasons, but not everything has been the same way that it appears to be right now. From a teacher's point of view, you might like to know that the pledge is basically unreadable. It's at a college level literacy. And so it's no wonder that many students are going to just echo the sounds of it and not really know what it says. Well, you may or may not have that as a daily routine, but every year, I wonder if you celebrated Columbus Day. This, along with Thanksgiving, has some problematic aspects to indigenous peoples. Because although it's supposed to promote tolerance and heritage, from their point of view, it was mostly a bit inaccurate and kind of hypocritical. And so in some states, we have got different celebrations there. Even if you have a charming story, like I loved Molly's Pilgrim, it was just a sweet little story, but it did not address anything about it. So, my friends, something else that's very patriotic is the Statue of Liberty. And perhaps you heard some memes and some funny news stories about France asking for it back. But let's go back to when it was originally brought. And so this is part of that great migration. And what's important to know is that at the base of it is a poem called The New Colossus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That sounds wonderful for hospitality, diversity, and inclusion. But you should know that this was a protest in reaction to the year before was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which filled with nationalism, bigotry, and privilege. So at the base of the Statue of Liberty is a statement saying we think it's better to be diverse instead of uniform. We think it's better to include people rather than exclude people. We think it's better to be fair instead of inequitable. Well, we have some other holidays to think about that are confusing to kids. I mentioned that I want to think about what a kid's point of view is. And Memorial Day is not an easy thing to explain to a child because it means it's too late to say thank you in person. You don't have to get into explaining what death is or anything. Most kids have an intuitive sense of it. But it is important to know that this was started by slaves, freed slaves who wanted to celebrate that there were some people who had done some noble things who had been ignored. It was very meaningful and popular. And so it was just that one battle that they were celebrating to start with. But within 3 years, it had become an annual tradition to recognize all of the people who died in the Civil War because so many had died. After World War I, they started to use it to talk about all of the soldiers who died in any of the wars. In 1950, they started adding a prayer for permanent peace And in 1968, you may not know this, there was an act of Congress to say, let's change all the holidays to Mondays so that we can have a 3-day weekend. And so that's why Memorial Day started to move to that Monday in May. Well, how is Memorial Day different than Veterans Day? Well, from a kid's point of view, veterans are still around, so there's still time to say thank you. The history is kind of interesting because this started from Armistice Day was after World War I, and it was on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And they tried to change it to a Monday, but the tradition was so strong that it has stayed at November 11th. Now, veterans are a pretty powerful concept to engage with students because most of them have got veterans in their families somewhere. So what do kids think about veterans? All kinds of people are American. All kinds of people are veterans. Veterans go on to do other things. Many people have been veterans with different cultural contributions. I hope you've heard the story about the code talkers who were able to successfully help with espionage. Veterans might be hurt. The Military Order of the Purple Heart is a peculiarly American institution started by Washington in the Revolutionary War because the Continental Congress would not pay them. They would not come up with the funding. He thought, at least I can let them know that I respect them and honor them. And so he designed this little thing out of fabric here that someone embroidered on it that said merit. And he gave one to each person who had been wounded. And what was unprecedented is that he did this for the enlisted soldiers, not just the officers. In Europe, only the officers would get medals. And so this was the start of saying that the people who are enlisted, the foot soldiers, they are contributing something important too, and they are citizens as well. And this is not just something that we use. Here's one of a meme that I have found very meaningful. We have the tomb of the unknown soldier, but we have soldiers who are known. And they are well known for having a lot of residual problems after having been in traumatic situations of battle. They could have physical wounds, but they also will often have mental health wounds, and there's supposed to be a lot of support for them. And this is why currently there is a huge outcry about the gutting of Veterans Administration support services. You talk to a veteran and they're going to say, I think that the first Tuesday in November should be a holiday. I want to make sure everybody participates in the election day. So this guy says, since it's Veterans Day, I thanked him for his service. Then he asked me if I did my civic duty on election day. I think this is one of the most important messages for teachers because you are public servants. You're paid for with tax dollars, and you are making sure that you are preparing citizens to participate in a democratic society. And so you have to also participate. And it takes work. It's not easy. You have to know what the issues are and you have to know how to vote. And it does take a little bit of time to do it. And if there are going to be threats to voting, that's called voter suppression, where it's difficult for people to vote, you have to be an advocate to help people participate. So November 5th is going to be election day, and you should know that you can't just show up and vote. You have to register. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, in Washington State, if you're in high school and you can vote, you get the day off to go register. It's that important. And from those voter registration rolls, that's where they also get people who are called up for jury duty, another civic duty. Well, Thanksgiving, I mentioned, was problematic before, but I thought you might like to know a little bit of the history here. Even in the very early years, they recognized Thanksgiving. It's very, very old. But it wasn't until after Gettysburg that Lincoln made it a national holiday. And he was accused at the time of just using a political ploy of trying to attract people just by promising them a day off. But in 1870, it did become part of the national holidays. At that time, there were only 4. In 1939, it's interesting that FDR moved it a week earlier, and the reason he did it is because it had become the start of Christmas shopping. And he wanted to make sure, because they're coming out of the Depression, that there was more opportunity for stores to sell things. And so shopping has always been a big part of Thanksgiving. But in 42, it went back to the 4th Thursday. So veterans protect their families. I think that's a fair thing for kids to believe, is that even if you disagree with the particular conflicts that the soldiers are involved in, even if you have very strong opinions about war, when you look at the individual person who served, you can give them the benefit of the doubt and think that they did it because they thought it was a good thing for their country and for their families. So it's not fair to put a child in the middle of a very ugly political debate. You have to choose very carefully what is important information they need to have, and what is something that helps them not just feel good about themselves and their family, but to try to find some sort of meaning in this. And that leads to what's called SEL, or social and emotional learning. All teachers in Washington State are expected to understand that there are 6 skills of social and emotional learning. There's self-awareness and social awareness, self-management and social management, self-efficacy, and social engagement. So I hope that this is helpful to try to put some perspective in the fact that holidays are very controversial, but at the same time, they can be very useful to help children make better sense of themselves and their families.